Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 271. And this time I'm going to talk about the different subgenres of jazz, because if you're just getting into jazz, or even if you've been dipping in for a while, it is quite easy to become confused with some of the terminology, and there is such an enormous variety of styles within the umbrella term jazz that just like the Carpenters or Metallica are both rock and roll, you can hear two different things that are both jazz and you might love one and dislike the other and not know where to direct your efforts or your cash. In this video, I'm going to focus on post-war jazz, by which I mean jazz between about 1945 and 1980. Now, clearly, there's lots of jazz that happens before then, right? So you've got ragtime, you've got swing, all the big bands all the way through the wartime years. You've got stride piano, you've got all that stuff. And all of that is definitely jazz and foundational for a lot of the stuff that comes afterwards, and a lot of it is excellent. But in my humble opinion, it's a different experience listening to that stuff than it is to this small group, better recorded, more virtuoso-focused music which came in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. You might also wonder why I'm not looking at jazz after 1980, and of course there is a ton of great music there, particularly some of the stuff that comes out on ECM since then. People like Jacob Bro, people like Vijay Iyer, the whole London scene which has been happening over the last decade, people like Shabaka Hutchings, Kamal Williams, the Sons of Kemet, Alpha Mist, Wildflower. These are all great, but that's kind of like saying, hey, I'd like to learn about the different styles of rock music, so let's start with the Arctic Monkeys and the Foo Fighters. So let's start the discussion with one basic fact, which is that for me, as a listener to jazz, as a consumer of jazz, as somebody who reads and thinks about jazz music, as far as I can tell, is black music. And at the beginning of this period, in 1945, there are two giant figures who go on to influence pretty much all the music which happens in the subsequent decades. One is a very traditional figure, one is a revolutionary. The first of those is Duke Ellington, that brilliant musician, composer, brilliant businessman as well, probably the preeminent big band figure, and Charlie Parker, the revolutionary, the guy behind bebop, the guy who shook up the whole world between the years of basically 1944 and 1948-49. So the big bands, not just Ellington, but Count Basie and Benny Goodman and others, through those war years they had dominated. But the music was getting increasingly formulaic. This was the way you did it. You had a big orchestra. It was basically bluesy, dance-oriented music. There was a way to do it. You had singers on the side, you had featured soloists and so on, but basically the orchestra was the thing, and it had a certain calculation to it. But big bands were also getting expensive. People increasingly had radios. They had record players. The LP had been invented in the middle 1940s, and this is a bit of a problem because this is seen by the big bands and all jazz musicians, or many of them anyway, as a threat. So there's actually a 2-year recording strike that happens between, I think, 45 and 47, thereabouts, where as an act of what they thought was self-preservation, jazz musicians refused to go into the studio to record, or at least their union did, and prevented that from happening. The fear is that people are going to stop going to live jazz. They're just going to sit at home, put on their LP with their 45 minutes worth of music, and Bob's your uncle, and jazz musicians will be out of work once they'd actually laid down the tracks. What actually happens is that the big bands lose steam. As I said, they're getting more expensive. It's hard to keep them together. Meanwhile, the beboppers, who are young musicians who are tired of the formulaic approach of the big bands, are playing bebop music, which is fast-paced, very experimental, highly improvisational, and highly innovative music, real musicians' music, not really with much commercial appeal, playing this after hours in clubs. And by the time that the LP finally gets some traction, when the recording strike is over, bebop, not big band music, has a grip on the imagination of the American listening public. So from this point, it all kicks off, and I'm going to talk about 10 different genres, beginning in this period and then moving forward to about 1980, not entirely chronologically, kind of chronologically. In doing this, I'm going to roll some of these genres together as well, partly for reasons of parsimony and partly because new collectors probably not going to get too bogged down in the difference between astral jazz and spiritual jazz, for instance, if in fact there is one. Okay, so let's get going. 10 different subgenres of jazz. The first I'll talk about is the dominant style at the beginning of this period, which of course is swing, the big bands. This is blues-based jazz dance music. It's highly accessible, it's lush, it's orchestrated, it's highly radio friendly. You've got banks of horns, you've got singers, you may have as many as 20 or more people on the bandstand, and it always swung as evidenced by the name. And what does it mean to swing? Well, a lot of people define that in different ways, but for me, if essentially you can listen to it and go sticks and you've got that kind of a thing going with your fingers, then it's swinging, and not all jazz swings. And so really for big bands, you're looking for anything by Ellington, by Count Basie, by Benny Goodman. I actually have very little in the way of big band music. It's not my thing, as I think I've made clear. I have rather sad-looking RCA Victor compilation of Duke's greatest. And part of it, too, is, of course, that in that era, LPs weren't the thing. As I mentioned, it was actually singles were the thing. And so typically compilations is how you're going to aggregate any sort of mass of Ellingtonia or Basie's work or so on. Anyway, good music, not so much my thing. Now, the second style I want to talk about is bebop. And this is one which is associated with Charlie Parker. And a word here about bebop, bop, hard bop, post bop. The only two terms that you really need to know, in my humble opinion, are bebop, which is the thing which comes first, which is the Charlie Parker oriented stuff which happens in the late 40s, and hard bop, which comes later on. I'll get to hard bop in a little bit, but talking about bebop, this is fundamentally a reaction to Ellingtonian big band orchestrated swing. Any jazz player who was making a living in 1943, 44, 45 was making a living playing in one of these big bands. But it got a bit tiring having to play this orchestrated music. The band leader had a very set repertoire they wanted to play. The dancers in the hall had music they wanted to hear. It was not a conducive environment to experimentation and improvisation. And improvisation, of course, is a core part of what jazz is. So these players start playing in small clubs, after hours, late at night, after everyone's gone home, really for themselves. It's musicians' music, and it's fast-paced. It's based on almost exclusively on improvisation. It usually swung, but it didn't always, and it was not as accessible as the big band music. And there was a lot of cultural struggle between the two types of musicians, with the beboppers calling the big band guys moldy figs. So some of the well-known beboppers are, I mentioned Charlie Parker, the alto saxophonist, also Max Roach, the drummer, Thelonious Monk, the pianist, and of course Dizzy Gillespie, the trumpeter. So you can find a lot of these players actually on one record, which is this record from 1953, which is a concert at Massey Hall in Toronto, put out as the quintet with Parker credited as Charlie Chan. Anyway, many of those guys are on there. Fantastic record. Also, another good example, Bird and Diz, where two of the giants of bebop get together. Bebop has its moment in the sun, but it has some limitations. It's not that commercially viable, and it's largely done as an art form by about 1955. And one of the things which comes along to replace it is a reaction to bebop, and that is what I'm going to call cool jazz, which is also sometimes called West Coast jazz. It's basically a reaction to bebop edginess. And although it is initially associated with Miles Davis, Miles always kind of walks his own path through all these different genres. There are lots of other people who are much more squarely associated with this type of music. Cool jazz, if it has an inheritance, is based on the languid playing of the swing-era saxophonist Lester Young. It's played in small groups, and while it's associated with Miles Davis, as I mentioned, it's actually much more associated with some of his contemporaries, most of whom happen to be white. It's prime dinner party martini music. It swings, but it was much cooler in social terms than swing music was at the time. It is accessible middle-class jazz. Some great examples of this include Jerry Mulligan. Here's an excellent record of his. He put out a ton of stuff. He's a baritone saxophonist. Time Out, the Dave Brubeck Quartet's 1959 chart topper. His saxophonist is a guy called Paul Desmond, and here's Desmond and Mulligan doing something. This would be very squarely in the cool jazz lane. And one more person to mention in terms of cool jazz is somebody who's going to pop up later in this video in another genre or subgenre, but that of course is Stan Getz, one of the smoothest tenor sax players that ever was. The heyday of cool jazz basically begins around the time that bebop, which it's helped ushering out the door, departs the early 1950s and goes to about the mid-1960s, but you can still hear cool jazz today in jazz clubs in any major city in the West. Go out tonight, you'll hear it. The fourth style I want to talk about, and this is the other use of the bop term, is hard bop. And this is a music which is also a reaction to bebop, but instead of making it accessible for basically white West Coast audiences and cocktail parties, this is an attempt to bring the music much more squarely back to its black roots, because bebop had, in the eyes of some, deviated from that. So it reintroduces blues, it reintroduces gospel, it brings in R&B sounds, and it slows the music down as well. One of the key instruments in hard bop is the tenor saxophone, because it's so able to mimic the male human voice. And a lot of hard bop has a real maleness too. It's macho and occasionally aggressive and competitive. It's also highly political because it's basically coterminous with the peak period of the Civil Rights Movement, 1955 to 1965. It's the music of the great jazz labels like Blue Note, like Prestige, like Riverside. It was a beatnik's favorite. It's edgy. Some great examples include people like Art Blakey and his band called the Jazz Messengers, which was basically a rotating group of young musicians whom he would occasionally ply with heroin. But anyway, classic hard bop. The great tenor saxophonist, pretty much the greatest on the scene until Coltrane shows up, Sonny Rollins, with a classic here, Way Out West. Jackie McLean, another great saxophonist, actually an alto saxophonist, and a whole string of albums around this time, all of which are very much sort of thematically cover-wise about civil rights. Horace Silver, who had an absolutely brilliant and long-lasting career, very bluesy, very soul-based, almost soul jazz at certain points, and I'll get to that in a bit. Then Miles Davis, certainly from about 1953-54 to about 1958, fits in this category, as does, in and around the same period, anything by John Coltrane in that era as well. Now at this point, I suspect I'm going to outrage a few purists, so I apologize in advance to the purists, by lumping a few different streams of jazz's development under the title of hard bop, because I think these are all related developments. And the first of those is soul jazz. What it shares with hard bop is moving away from bebop and back to embrace gospel, R&B, and blues. It just does a lot more of that. It basically gets almost all the way over into gospel, R&B, and blues, but still using jazz instrumentation and often players who swing back and forth between the jazz and R&B lanes. And what it basically does is take the formula for hard bop and moves it right down to the pelvic region. So some examples of this are Jimmy Smith, incredible Hammond organist, who also has an incredible series of record covers for you to enjoy. There's a guy called Lou Donaldson, really consistently good music. Another artist who is kind of in her own lane, really, but is as much soul jazz as she's anything, because she, like Miles Davis, probably like Coltrane, kind of defies easy categorization. And that, of course, is Nina Simone. Here's a great album of hers from, I think, 1970, Black Gold. But she was certainly comfortable blending soul music and jazz. A second stream, which is basically a child of hard bop, is modal jazz. And this is what happens in the late 1950s when Miles Davis and some of his collaborators decide that they're tired of playing the same old chord changes, which are basically blues-based and lead you down a certain path, and want to experiment just with playing music around the notes of a scale of one particular chord. And this becomes known as modal jazz. There's more scientific descriptions of that, but that'll do for now. And of course, probably the most famous modal jazz record of all is this one, which comes out in 1959, which is one of the first ones, which is Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, which also features Cannonball Adderley and John Coltrane and a whole host of other excellent folks, Bill Evans as well, the great piano player. You can also probably fit John Coltrane's A Love Supreme in this category as well. This is still when he's kind of within the modal envelope before he heads off in a more spiritual and free jazz vein. Andrew Hill in there as well. So again, this is pretty close to hard bop, and if you're new to jazz, you're not really going to be able to tell much of a difference. You will find that it is less bluesy and a little more, I don't know, cerebral, I guess, as a style of music. But anyway, it's some of the greatest jazz which has ever been recorded. The final stream, or child of hard bop, which I'm going to mention here, is maybe a little further from hard bop than the other two, but I'm still going to kind of fit it in because it kind of flows out of the modal piece as well. And that's the more European-based kind of music, which I'm going to refer to by the name of a record label, ECM, which is a record label started in the 60s. It's a European label based out of Germany, often with European players, sometimes with American players, sometimes American-European jazz combos, and probably the most famous ECM record of all, and it tends to be more classically inspired than it is blues-based. And probably the most famous record in this category is this one, Keith Jarrett's a live recording the Colon concert, which is, I think, 1975 or something around there. But pretty much anything that ECM puts out is super high quality, and there's a lot of contemporary stuff happening on ECM right now as well. People like Vijay Iyer or Jakob Bro or people like that. Anyway, that's a third stream. Broadly undetectable, the difference between this and hard bop if you're new to jazz. And just before we leave hard bop, a word about the term post-bop, which is, in my view, totally unhelpful as a term. Basically describes anything which comes after 1965, which is descended from hard bop, but it doesn't really describe any specific kind of music, so ignore it. So now I'm going to talk about the fifth subgenre, and for me, this can be called Latin jazz, or probably most accurately, Cuban-influenced Latin jazz. Now, I told you this wasn't totally chronological, and this is something which actually emerges around the same time, or a little bit after, bebop, because it's an innovation in particular of Dizzy Gillespie, who starts paying attention to Cuban music. Now, you have to recall that up until 1960, Cuba played a role in American society, particularly East Coast society, which was kind of a combination of Hawaii and Las Vegas. And in fact, Las Vegas, as it is now, largely owes its existence to the fact that the Cuban Revolution happens and shuts down all that den of iniquity. Anyway, what happens because of all this interplay is the stuff which is cool in Cuba starts to become cool in the US. Dance crazes in particular, the rumba, the mambo. And when the revolution happens, you get all these Cubans who move to the States. Plus you have the influence of Puerto Rico. Plus you have the influence of Dominica and other Latin American countries in and around the Caribbean. And so some well-known examples of this, particularly amongst those you might say who are imported into the jazz tradition, who are much more on kind of the Latin side, people like Tito Puente, Mongo Santa Maria, who did all kinds of crossover work with mainstream jazz artists, with boogaloo artists in the 1960s, and also with straight-up legit Latin music. Cal Jader, who I think was of Swedish extraction by way of Minnesota or something like that. Anyway, he turned himself into a premier practitioner of Latin jazz music in the later part of the 1950s, and all of his records are fantastic. That's the kind of thing you're into. And a special shout out too to somebody who kind of straddles the jazz, Latin, and pop lanes, but certainly guests in a whole bunch of jazz records as well. And that's the percussionist Ray Barretto. And this particular record, Acid, from the late 60s, will rock your world. So this whole Latin jazz thing happens in part as a reaction to the insularity of the US jazz scene, but also in part as the world got bigger for Americans after the war, because they were the only country largely left standing. The other cultures were there for them to pillage, and so that happened there. And there's also an element of globalization which applies to the next, our sixth subgenre, which is also Latin, but a different kind of Latin, and that's Bossa Nova, which is not Spanish-speaking country inspired. This is driven by the music of Brazil. So what happens here, of course, is that Brazilians have their own musical traditions. There were indigenous Brazilian musical influences. There was samba, which had grown from all that. There was a very strong European compositional influence in Brazil as well. But they were also super taken with the boom in American jazz in the 1950s. Hard bop, cool jazz, bebop, and so on. And they began to blend the musical traditions of Brazil with the instrumentation in the small group setting of jazz. And what comes out of that is the Bossa Nova, which takes samba rhythms, slows them down, plays them with jazz instruments, plays them in a very kind of intimate way, infused with this whole idea of melancholy or sadness, or the Portuguese term is saudade. This is, in my humble opinion, some of the most beautiful music which has ever been recorded in its pure form. It's also the primest cocktail party music you could ever want to put on a turntable. You'll see a lot of people lump this in under Latin jazz with Cuban music. Wrong, wrong, wrong. It has nothing to do with Cuba. It is not influenced by the music of Cuba at all. The beats are all different and the feel is totally different. I feel very strongly about this. It takes off in Brazil in about 1958-59, and then in 1962 it goes viral because a whole bunch of Americans come down on State Department tours to Brazil in the 1960s, around 1960, 61, 62. They're blown away by Bossa Nova. They get back to the States, they start to make records, and these records go global. And in their own way, it's the first real globalization of jazz, in that this music sweeps the world, well, certainly the Western world and many other countries as well, but also is a fusion of jazz and some other global traditions. A lot of the stuff, though not all the stuff, by Sergio Mendes, particularly, I guess, his earlier work, not so much the popular stuff that happens when he has Brazil 66 later in the decade, but I think much more importantly, anything between 1959 and 1965, which is a recording of a tune written by Antonio Carlos Jobim. And of course, the most famous record that fits this category is this effort from 1963, released in 64, Gets Gilberto, which of course features Jobim himself on piano, and most of the tracks are written by him. Jazz Samba, this was the one which really broke open the gates of the international craze. And a shout out too to the music of Jobim himself, which sometimes can be a little bit overproduced and syrupy, but sometimes is just excellent. So the wave of Bossa Nova crashes with a bang on the global beach around 1963, 64. Switching gears, however, let's talk about another very different kind of approach, which also caused major shockwaves, not all of them happy ones. What I'm talking about here, of course, is free jazz. I'm also lumping in avant-garde jazz, or sometimes what people refer to as the new thing, from about 1958-59 on all the way through the 70s. If bebop had been a reaction to the formulaic nature of big band swing music, and if modal jazz had been a reaction to the rigid expectation of having chord changes and certain chord structures in jazz by stripping it down just to the notes of one chord, then free jazz is a rejection of the tyranny of all of it. Why do we have to have any of these inherited pieces, especially when the essence of jazz, the essence of black music, is improvisation? Unsurprisingly, given this philosophy and given the time it emerges, this is also highly political music. It's highly associated with the Black Power movement, and it's also associated with the exploration of self-consciously black art. Therefore, in one way of thinking, this is about the jazziest jazz, peak of the mountain jazz you could possibly achieve, which doesn't mean it's that accessible. In fact, this music was capable of driving away some of the most legit jazz people in the history of this particular kind of music. And that includes people like Charles Mingus, it includes McCoy Tyner, John Coltrane's piano player, it includes Elvin Jones, who was playing drums in that quartet, both of whom left because they couldn't take the free jazz direction that Coltrane was taking and the new players he was bringing in. Elvin Jones said, all I could hear was noise. McCoy Tyner said, I couldn't hear what I was playing. If that all serves as a warning, let me also encourage you to take off your shoes and socks and jump in. Some great examples include the argumentative piano player Cecil Taylor, really the godfather of it all, Ornette Coleman and his classic twin quartet, Archie Shepp, a really interesting guy, kind of a protege of Coltrane's, who does a ton of free jazz in the 60s and early 70s, but also moves back into a very solidly R&B influenced lane, sometimes on the same record. So his records are always interesting. You never know quite what you're going to get, and always super high quality. This one is a complete banger. And if you want to get your feet wet in free jazz, I would suggest first listening to the title track on this record. Let's not forget John Coltrane's Ascension, the record about which McCoy Tyner said, I wasn't sure what he was trying to do. Pretty much all the music by that tragic figure Albert Ayler. And moving into the 70s, pretty much all the recorded output of Anthony Braxton. Two other labels to mention in terms of free jazz, Strata East is one, and also famous label Impulse Records. And speaking of Impulse Records, let's now move on to the 8th subgenre, and that is spiritual jazz, sometimes also called astral jazz. Spiritual jazz can best be understood as a more melodic and reflective manifestation of the impulses which also led to free jazz. It's characterized by long tracks, commonly album side length tracks. There is a lot of free expression, some free jazz, but generally within this kind of cosmic, trippy, mellow kind of a vibe. It's music to smoke a big fatty to. It's also music to blow the minds of people who kind of think they know jazz but may not know it all. It was a whole late 60s, early 70s vibe, and Impulse Records had the best of it. In particular, two artists really stand out here. One of whom I've just mentioned, is Pharoah Sanders, who put out a string of banging records between about 1967, 68, 1972, 3 on Impulse. Alice Coltrane, who herself also had a great string of records, very distinct from the work she did with her husband. Another great one, very hard to get. This is a knockoff copy, which still sounds pretty good, and actually still costs a pretty penny. Patah the El Daoud. A couple other Pharaohs that are worth picking up. Sanders' Karma is fantastic. That's the one with The Creator Has a Master Plan. And the first of his journey in this particular direction, Tawheed. Honorable mention too to the remarkable Lonnie Liston Smith. Great string of records, particularly in the early 70s on Flying Dutchman. The 9th subgenre I'm going to talk about is jazz funk. Now, this occurs around the same time as the free jazz thing is happening and the spiritual jazz thing is happening. And if what I see in free jazz and spiritual jazz is a sort of cerebral and aesthetic musical journey into the black experience, then jazz funk is the absolute opposite. It's also about the black experience, but it's about recognizing that the black audience by 1970 had basically deserted jazz because jazz had just become so esoteric and up its own behind, it had lost contact with its grounding in American black music. So jazz funk is an effort to track down this long gone audience and to meet them where they were, which at the time was with Motown and with James Brown. Here you're looking for pretty much anything with Kudu Records and the slightly more adult contemporary versions of that on CTI. All of that has got the producer Creed Taylor's imprint on it. And some great examples would include people like Roy Ayers, who then went on to have a fantastic its kind of underground career in the disco era. Grover Washington Jr., who just lights up kudu releases in the early 1970s. Donald Byrd, another one of these artists who really kind of defies categorization because his career is so long and he plays in a bunch of different subgenres. But his work in the early 70s, things like Street Lady, just fantastic examples of this. And two more that I'd mention, another guy who crosses a whole bunch of different genre boundaries, but in the 70s was very funky, Herbie Hancock. This one is a great one, Manchild. And another long-lived group who changed their name and changed their style halfway through, the Jazz Crusaders, who by the early 70s had dropped the jazz part and were just the Crusaders. Still pretty jazzy, but very, very, very funky, and almost anything from their early to mid-70s period is worth collecting. The final style I'm going to talk about also occurs in this period, in the late 60s and early 1970s. Like jazz funk, seeking an audience that was lost to jazz, but unlike jazz funk, not seeking it by going deeper and deeper into black music, in fact driving the other way, going towards more classical influences, going towards more rock influences and combinations, and this of course is jazz fusion or jazz rock. This music is technically brilliant, but it doesn't always swing. If you've seen the videos I've done with Jonas Samuelson of Sublimedia, where we talk about fusion music, this is music who, for instance, people who love prog rock just tend to love. If you're more into music that's got a real beat and a groove to it, it tends to be not your thing necessarily. Anyway, so I don't have a ton of it. I do have one of the classics in the genre, which is John McLaughlin's work with the Mahavishnu Orchestra, the Inner Mounting Flame from the early 70s. You can also put people like Pat Metheny in this category, Al Di Meola, and so on. Finally, a note about an 11th subgenre which kind of fits into this time period and which I haven't really talked about to date, and that is of course smooth jazz. Smooth jazz is jazz for people who thought jazz funk and bossa nova were too edgy. It includes people like Chuck Mangione, Al Jarreau, George Benson, certainly after about 1975 until he has a bit of a renaissance later on. All fine musicians, but probably courting a bit of controversy. I'm just going to say I might start other places rather than here, unless you're shooting a retirement lifestyle ad, in which case you might want to embrace it. So I hope this was helpful. I try and do all my videos to be the kinds of things that I would have wanted to find when I was first getting into jazz, and this was something which I struggled with for a long time. Like, what are these different genres and what do they mean? Love to hear people's thoughts and comments, corrections in the comments below. I'm also going to create a title playlist, which I'll put in the description below based on the records I talked about here, so you can go through that and get a bit of a sense of what we're talking about. Anyway, love to hear from you. Thanks very much for watching. Please do subscribe and please do click that little bell so you get reminded to watch videos in the future, and we'll see you next time.